Some users have been reacting to my previous video. Good for them. Some have posted a link to a series of points that seem to state I'm full of nonsense. Normally I don't care, but this is rather detailed, so I thought I'd flex a muscle or two. This link is on the RPGCODEX forum and was a post made by some user named C. Check out the link in the description for this post. This is what he wrote. Man, Smudboy went off the fucking deep end. Guy is great at criticizing plots, but either he stopped analyzing his own arguments now before posting them, or he just completely fails game design, or maybe just got his head stuck in a bucket. First off, this is filled with ad hominems, so we can bet most of this is made with emotional knee-jerk reactions and their thoughts aren't very significant, although I do appreciate their detail, spelling, and grammar. Second, I criticize everything in the narrative, not just the plot. Third, I analyze and edit my own arguments pretty well. Fourth, I went to school for video game design and development, although we didn't look at the argument between real-time and turn-based, we were too busy making games. In hindsight, they were all real-time, probably because we were learning about physics as well, so I could be a bit biased there. Fifth, I'm actually making a game with several flavors of turn-based combat. It is in fact a spiritual successor, and I know many of their limitations at least the ones that we're designing. Sixth, I've been a fan of RPGs since the 80s, and I've said before in my previous video, I'm a fan of both combat systems because I love games from both. I merely know the problems and limitations in turn-based combat engines in relation to the narrative and thus believability, because by design, they're self-explanatory. And seventh, this is from a site called RPGCODEX. There just might be a certain bias towards RPGs and all things turn-based, so obviously anyone who has any critique about a combat system in RPGs probably isn't going to be liked too much. Anyway, let's get into this. 1. He argues that XCOM was well received by XCOM fans because it had turn-based combat, apparently oblivious to all the criticism it got for its major systemic and mechanical reductions. Please show me these hardcore fans of the old XCOM games that are deeply in love with the new modern classic. I'll wait. Here's the Metacritic for the XCOM Enemy Unknown 2012, and here's the Metacritic for the Bureau XCOM Declassified. And here are the user reviews. I rest my case. As for the streamlining of the 2012 game, yeah, I was aware of that, but I didn't really care. You could say I'm nostalgic and apparently not a hardcore fan of the original. As always, there's going to be a vocal minority of hardcore fans for anything. Good for the XCOM series, I don't really care. Why? Because the XCOM series never had any good stories to tell. They don't really concern me. The game was fun to play, as was the new one. 2. Apparently Fallout used turn-based combat due to technical limitations. Yep, that old chestnut. Well, I can't speak for certain on why Tim Kaine went with a turn-based system despite being shown a video of him talking about it. I can recite some history and my own personal situations and explanations of computer technology of the 90s. Let's also not forget Fallout did use a real-time system for exploration, so adapting a rule set to a real-time system would have worked just fine for combat. Aside from some potential slowdowns a lot of scenes might have had, like decreasing the enemy type or number. This is considering the software and hardware technology of the time. Fallout, made by Interplay, was a spiritual successor to Wasteland, which came out in '88. Tim Kaine made the Fallout engine from scratch, based around GURPS, a tabletop rule set, but Interplay couldn't get the license to it, so they changed it for another system called Special. This was cool since Kaine made the rule set modular, so no big problem. Tim Kaine said they loved XCOM, which came out in '94, and based the system around that. He built the engine in 6 months, then later hired 30 people to finish the game in 3 years, and Fallout came out in '97. Despite the success of Diablo, which was released in '96, which was real-time, Tim still decided to keep with the turn-based combat system, even though the exploration part of the system was in real time. During the 90s, there were many RTSs that came out, like the grandfather of RTSs, Dune 2 in '92, Warcraft in '94, and Command & Conquer in '95. Fallout was nearly cancelled after Interplay got the rights to Forgotten Realms and Planescape, but Tim Kaine convinced the company to finish his project to release in '97. A year later in '98, Interplay published Baldur's Gate, made with the Infinity engine by BioWare, which was real-time with pause. Now, back in these days, they probably weren't using SDL, which I think came out in '98, which means the Fallout engine was made either with OpenGL or DirectX 1-3, or Tim Kaine is some sort of assembly wizard like John Carmack. Using DirectX 1 for Windows 95 created a huge performance drop in comparison to coding something directly from DOS. It wasn't until DirectX 5 that Windows development was more practical and stable. DirectX 5 came out in August of '97, and Fallout came out in September of '97. While Tim Kaine is a genius, I don't think he and his team were having code standards for graphical rendering libraries. They were too busy making a game. Fallout 2 came out in '98. Despite there being the Infinity engine and better renderers and hardware, they just took the antiquated Fallout engine and within a year made a sequel. This was released on Windows and Mac and not DOS, but that just means that's where the market was for OSs, not whether they were using a new renderer or new hardware features or level 2 cache properly or any other of the newer Pentium chips features or 3D accelerators at the time. Fallout 1 and 2 were known for massive bugs, memory leaks, slowdowns, and crashes, despite using an older system on newer hardware. This could be attributed to the famous Windows 98 crashes, which were caused by its own memory leaks. Despite Planescape Torment, which I also enjoyed in, I think it was '98 or '99, Fallout 2 is my favorite '90s PC RPG, and it crashed almost every time I played the game on my Pentium 2 266 at the time. Planescape Torment might have slowed down a few times and crashed a few times, but never during combat as far as I can recall. Fallout 2, sometimes the turn would never end, that crazy hazard symbol on the bottom right would never close, and a bunch of other problems next to the combat and all the bugs there. There were patches for both games, but I had the most technical problems with Fallout 2. That, to me, with only 1 year difference between Fallout 1, despite there being better technology at the time to make a better game, says a lot about the lack of a robust QA cycle, not spending more money to use new technology to even consider it, level design that would probably slow down a real-time combat system, Tim Kaine only working on the first part of Fallout 2, and thus, I don't know, a series of technical limitations. I could be wrong, however. 3. So, turn-based combat is bad because unrealistic to have people stand around and wait. Yes. Is he fucking joking? No. Apparently nobody told him limited movement and actions and the conceit of turns are used to divide time up into discrete units to facilitate more fine-grained control than what real-time options allow. There is no fine-grained control in a turn-based system. There's just the turn. That's all there is. You're forced to make the turn. There is, however, fine-grained control in a real-time system with pause because you can pause as much as you want. You can be as granular as you like. With a turn-based system, that's it. That's all you get. There's only the turn. A coder from both systems can code a whole whack of functions or tactics just as much as the other. The difference is the frequency of using pause is controllable and thus fine-grained. Turn-based is only the turn in some sort of pseudo-time-space world where people, yes, do indeed, have to stand around and wait for their turn. He continues, or maybe every board game where you take turns ever also fucking sucks because it's unrealistic too, who can say? Well, we're not talking about chess or board games, we're talking about the narrative, which is a story, a world, a universe within the game. It's fictional or otherwise, the setting and the metaphysics of the world have to be shown or told to the audience. My problem exists primarily with a turn-based system on top of a real-time system. That is, a turn-based combat system on top of a real-time exploration one. Without a setting and without storytelling, we have only reality to fall back on, and reality is in real time. So why are people standing around doing these actions and turns? Where's the story here? Did the dogs and monsters also agree to this? 4. He's perfectly fine with Wasteland 2 upgrading Wasteland 1's combat, even though they are almost nothing alike other than both feature turns and both are driven by a skill system. Alright? First, Wasteland 2 is a sequel, not a spiritual successor. These guys can do whatever they want with their own license and franchise. Second, they're both turn-based combat. What's wrong with improving the old system? That's what you do in software when you make a new iteration or you reinvent the wheel. The idea is to make the wheel better and not an octagon. Third, making a sequel also with a turn-based engine is pretty straightforward. What's the problem here? I certainly have no problem with Wasteland 2, so what's the issue? I don't get it. 5. If you want to get technical, Infinity Engine games weren't real-time with pause. They were round-based with real-time interrupts. Or is real-time with pause a modern upgrade of the outdated round-based combat 2? Why is one thing a brand new combat system entirely and one just an upgrade? Oh right, when it's convenient for your argument. Well, here's a list of Infinity Engine games and extensions. You got Baldur's Gate, Tales of Sword Coast, Planescape Torment, Icewind Dale, Heart of Winter, Trials of Lure Master, Baldur's Gate 2, Throne of Ball, and then there's the Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2 Enhanced Editions. All of these games are Infinity Engine, and they're real-time with pause. Now, I don't know how they're technically turn-based. Either we have words that define categories, or we're arguing semantics, which I simply don't do. I know you can issue commands, and these commands generate actions and activities. Actions and behaviors are behaviors that are measured in things that are less than a second, so very quickly or instantly, whereas activities are more than a second. I've never actually timed the various behaviors in Infinity Engine games to compare. I've never gone under the hood to see how it works, but I can believe that these things happen in seconds, whether you call them rounds or not. I guess how the computer measures that can be put into blocks of seconds, or a standard block, or a tick count, like every spell or skill could be 5 seconds or something like that. But really, who cares? Not every real-time with pause game uses that engine or that rule set, and whether you technically think they're the same, they're all still real-time with pause games. It's the perception of the scene, the narrative that matters, not whether it's technically the same. It certainly doesn't look or play the same to me, and that's why we have categories. So, if the user is trying to tell me that A equals B, then this should be their real main point, and everything else is irrelevant because we're all saying the same thing anyway and quibbling over the details. Clearly, that is not the case here. So maybe, perhaps, real-time with pause is technically a modern upgrade of the outdated round-based combat. And if it isn't, then this point is completely moot. Okay, 6. Come to think of it, Wasteland 1 was phase-based too, not turn-based. So Wasteland 1 is round-based, and Wasteland 2 is turn-based. Betrayal, I demand another video, Smudboy. First off, phase-based is a subcategory of turn-based. Phase or no, there are still turns. Check out the link in the description for a list of systems. Second, as I said before, Wasteland 2 is a sequel. They can do what they want with it. And thirdly, you're welcome. 7. And let's not even mention Fallout 3, which he conveniently ignores in his list of spiritual successors which had different combat systems. Oops. First, I don't need to mention Fallout 3. Why should I? Is it in contention in some sort? I don't think so. I did provide a giant list of spiritual successors for people to look at for themselves, and I did ask them to look at differences. That could be your example. What's your point? Second, Fallout 3 was a sequel, not a spiritual successor by virtue of there being a 3 in the title. I could be wrong here. Third, Fallout 3 was acquired by Bethesda and made with a version of the Gamebryo engine, which was used to make Oblivion, and the game was made by the Oblivion team. Different people were involved here. Fourth, it was a 3D real-time FPS, which had new hardware, new technology, new team, a new engine, and a lot more development time than Fallout 2. But really, this point is arguing apples and oranges on a non sequitur. And overall, the jump to 3D real-time was a fantastic improvement on just about every level. The rendering of the story in Fallout 3 is so much more detailed and visual and real, as the very detailed 3D combat, and VATS, though not perfect, does a very fantastic, detailed, gory job of how brutal life is like in the Wasteland. And this is from me, someone who likes using the Bozar in Fallout 2 to blow away little mole rats. 8. He says he expects a Planescape Torment sequel to be a D&D-based game. Did he miss the memo that Torment 2 will not feature the D&D's license or rule set? If his argument was consistent, he should be outraged at that fundamentally not merely the combat system. No, I didn't miss the memo. First, in my first point of my previous video, I said this. Thus, the spiritual successor to a game is its gameplay. The spiritual successor to Gran Turismo is a driving simulator. To StarCraft, I expect a RTS. To League of Legends, I expect a MOBA. To Planescape Torment, I expect a D&D-based Infinity Engine-style game with the real-time with pause combat engine. That does not imply I want the same rule set. It means I expect a D&D-based Infinity Engine-style game with a real-time with pause combat engine. This is all within the context of talking about real-time with pause and turn-based combat systems. In my fifth point, I specifically state that Torment Tides of Numenera is using the Numenera tabletop rule set, which is easier to implement than the D&D rule set. Numenera is a tabletop game and apparently has a very simple series of rules and things to follow to play. And if more complex D&D rules can be translated into Baldur's Gate and various other Infinity Engine games back in the day, the simpler rule set of Numenera can be done even easier. By nature of tabletop games, all gameplay in those are turn-based. Yet, the more complex D&D rule set was working just fine in all the Infinity Engine games, which were D&D, over 10 years ago. And we simply can't do that today? Now, to most people, a tabletop game is a tabletop board game, and that's usually D&D. Obviously, I should have been more specific in my first point, but if you were paying attention to my fifth, you'd know what I was talking about. So it's not that my arguments weren't consistent, at least I don't think so, it's that the author wasn't paying attention to them. 9. So, real-time with pause is more tactical than turn-based combat because you can interrupt actions. Yes, because that implies if you have more control, thus more options, thus more tactics, then yes, real-time with pause provides one extra tactic, interrupting tactics. The only actions you'd ever really need to interrupt in turn-based games are movement orders, which you can kind of make up for by thinking ahead and not doing stupid shit in the first place, or just giving smaller movement orders 2 grid spaces at a time instead of 10. Okay, first off, this is a blanket and subjective statement saying that the only actions you would do or what a generic player would ever want or need to cancel our stupid movements. No, I have several reasons why when I make a command I cancel it and do another, like I decide to take the heat off another character as opposed to attacking a lone enemy, or using a new ability like, I don't know, healing, or maybe try a different tactic or strategy like, I don't know, retreating. Just like how a street fight is largely chaotic. It requires quick reaction time and you have to change how you think. Not to mention there's no need to interrupt in a turn-based system because only one combatant moves at a time, so basically tactics equals the ability to correct for your own mistakes. Please enlighten me, Smudboy. Well, here I am enlightening you. If there's more tactics, and by virtue of a turn-based system not having said tactics, then there's more tactics in another system. And no, tactics do not equal the ability to correct for your own mistakes. That's merely an example of a tactic which doesn't exist in turn-based, hence more in another. In turn-based, once you commit and end your turn, you're done. You can't go back. In real time, you can cancel your existing command while it's conducted. In this example, that's all I'm saying. 10. Turn-based combat turns your character into dolls. Have you played the BioWare games you are so praising, Smudboy? This is personally my favorite comment by this person. I'm one of BioWare's most vocal critics, I think. I do critiques of many of their games, and there's a lot of reasons to do so. I do not give undulating praise on them whenever they release a title, that's for sure, and it's quite the contrary. Rarely do I give them praise, so I think the writer here never actually paid attention to any of my videos, let alone my previous one. For Mass Effect, which I seem to know for quite some time, you can pause the game and tell your 2 teammates to switch weapons, for example. Shepard says, switch up, and then they do it. They sound like teammates following orders, not like dolls. But on the first statement he made, turn-based combat does turn your characters into dolls, or automatons, or dumb terminals, or mindless chess pieces, or generic actors that are suddenly at the mercy of a combat engine. Their minds are gone. They are no longer the characters we knew them in previous cutscenes. They're now just game pieces. The narrative here is not consistent. Now, with Mass Effect, everyone has a voice actor, so Shepard saying things, the team saying things in combat adds to that believability, even if it's just largely cosmetic. And again, this isn't my opinion. These are what my eyes and ears are showing me. 11. False dichotomy to say that turn-based has tons of variance and real-time with pause doesn't. In real-time with pause, you have all sorts of questions like being accused of a logical fallacy. I would love it. Well, I'm sure every system has variables and differences, and I'm going to get to these questions listed later, but let's look at the underlying idea of what constitutes a real-time with pause game. Okay, things happen in real time. You can pause that action, and there's a level where you can see and pause these things in real time. That's it. That's the definition. Real time, pause, and a level. That's what you need for a real-time with pause game or a real-time with pause system. All the details and variations exist that deviate from that are based on the further designs. if you look at all the real-time with pause games, and this is a small list here, so I could be wrong, but let's look at these examples. There's the Infinity Engine games. They're pretty much all the same. There's the BioWare games, the Mass Effects, the Dragon Ages, Jade Empire, Knights of the Old Republic, Neverwinter Nights. There's RTSs, Age of Empires, Company of Heroes, Empire Earth, and Supreme Commander. There's like building sim games, like, I don't know, SimCity maybe, Caesar, Cultures, Theme Hospital, Railroad Tycoon, Evil Genius. These are all real-time with pause games, and they all involve real-time, they all involve optional pause, and they all involve a level. They differ in that they're different games, and there's obviously different things to do and control, but those three things are all the same. But in turn-based, you get a whole bunch of variations. A turn is not necessarily just a turn. You're still forced to take a turn, and such turns and time are cut up, but for the most part, it is not free-flowing, and time and space are cut up, and they start and stop in different ways. So naturally, there's going to be a lot more variation on how time is cut up and how you render a turn, and on the actions and activities you perform based on the other game designs. If you don't believe me, here's a Wikipedia link in the description if you want to get to know them a bit better. Number 1. The first and simplest is what I would call the menu turn-based system. If you look at things like Dragon Quest series, there's also a real-time exploration scenes. The special encounter goes to a turn-based combat system. I think Wasteland 1 does something like that too. It looks like it. This is also similar to the Pokemon series, and because there's no level, there's zero strategy involved. Recall that strategy is the orientation and position of one's forces in relation to another. So these kinds of games are purely tactical, and this is about as simple as it gets. Then there's the I go, you go system. If you look at TRPGs, you have a level where you move units and enact tactics. So the second one is where you have two major kinds of tactical RPGs. There's the stat-based, meaning a speed stat determines who moves first, and then there's a giant queue for determining that. This is also referred to as initiative. And there's a third system called phase-based, where the two opposing forces do all of their moves and then wait for the other team to do theirs. So both these systems involve stats for turns, like action points, to determine how far one can move and conduct actions, such as Fallout. Or sometimes there's just movement distances based on your movement distance stat, and with given skills to perform at the end of that movement, like in Final Fantasy Tactics. The fourth one is the active time battle system, which is by Square, and they actually, I think they bought the copyright to that. And this is in their Final Fantasy series, as well as other games like Chrono Trigger, where everyone stands around waiting for their turn to come up. By having an active time bar fill, you can tell the game to pause when you're making your turn, when your turn comes up for your character, if you so choose in the settings, or you and other characters' bars will also fill, and the enemies will attack you when their turn comes up. This is like in Dragon Quest. This originally had problems with attacking nothing when you had more than one character who killed a monster while another monster was there, but that problem has been resolved in the future iterations of, well, Japan pretty much churning out these games like crazy. And then there's the fifth flavor, where there's the We Go system, which is really cool. I actually like this one, found in the Master of Orion series, where turns are broken down into decision and execution phases. So you make your decision to move your forces a certain way, and so does the computer. Then you execute that, and they all just sort of smash into each other. There's the sixth one called the clock-based system. This one I don't know. I've never tried these games, but this is apparently one of the most realistic turn-based systems, where turns exist and end based on the duration of the behavior ordered. This is found in games like Typhoon of Steel and MechForce. The seventh one are referred to as hybrids. There's the Total War series, there's Ogre Battle, there's XCOM, and Jagged Alliance, which involves strategic turn-based with real-time combat, or vice versa. The eighth variation of turn-based is user choice-based multiple combat system, like XCOM Apocalypse, Fallout Tactics, Arcanum, where the player can choose what flavor of several types of turn-based / real-time combat there is. So that's pretty much what's there. Lots of flavors of turn-based, but really only one definitive real-time with pause. Okay, so let's look at these questions in relation to whether the differences in real-time with pause games and see if they're relevant. Remember, we're only looking for the existence of a level, whether time is real time, and whether they involve an optional pause. Can you interrupt actions? To what extent? Sure, some games allow that. It occurs in real time. This is not really relevant to our criteria, however, so it's just really an extra option on top of the existing system. Can you queue orders? If so, how many? Some you can, some you can't. This is really game specific. Do your friendly units have artificial intelligence? How effective and extensive is it? Can you program it yourself? I would assume most do. I don't know. This is ultimately irrelevant to our definition, however. Can attacks miss at all, or do they always hit? That's based on the rule set, which is regardless of the combat engine. You can make this argument for turn-based or any other combat system, so it's completely irrelevant. Do you use cooldowns to regulate actions or some other method? That's purely a choice made by the player on how to play or what to do next. You could say the same thing of any engine, whether using cooldowns or cooldowns with skill points like mana or something. So it's kind of irrelevant to what style or flavor or a type of definition of a different type of real-time with pause combat engine is. I'm not sure about that. Okay, next one. How much do player skills factor in versus character skills? Okay, this one's a bit out in left field because it's such a loaded and out-of-scope question. I don't think I'm going to bother even touching that. Can you play the game like a button masher and win easily, or do you get your ass kicked unless you are tactical? Okay, I've never played a real-time with pause game as a button masher. I even played Dragon Age 2 with the awesome button, and I never did that. So I don't know. This is not Street Fighter. This is not Devil May Cry. So maybe he's referring to a different genre. I don't know. If button mashing is a thing in real-time with pause, I have no idea. More to the point, do you balance for players who pause or players who don't? At a certain point, you are making two combat systems in one, and both have to be compatible and work in a way that feels fair and natural. More to the point. So is this the main point? Okay, within this context, we're not game designers grading a system here, so talking about creating balance is really irrelevant, and we're not really making anything with two combat systems unless you're talking about a hybrid or a game where we can choose the combat system like an Arcanum. I don't know what the point is, and really this is way out of scope for a statement of fact or for an argument on the variations of what real-time with pause is. It's like the poster is arguing against a designer. Is the game balanced? I have no idea. Ask a designer who made a specific game that. This is whether the difficulty is good for one play style. I don't know. What does that have to do with the flavor of a real-time with pause game engine? Is there such a thing as this? I don't know. Okay, case in point. Dragon Age, KOTOR, Dragon Age 2, Mars War Logs, The Witcher 2, etc. all play radically different. Once again, let's just ignore everything that doesn't work with your argument, right? Okay, so there's more to the point. And now a case in point. Okay, so, well, that's because those listed are different games and use different rules and different functions. How are these different types of real times with pause, though? This entire list is fallacious, but you know what? All the real-time with pause games listed by myself in the poster, they all have these three things. They all involve real-time actions, they all involve optional pause, and they all involve a level displaying those real-time actions. So, unless I'm mistaken, I only see one variation of real-time with pause, and I've listed 8 variations of the turn-based system, so there could be more. Hey, enlighten me if I don't know. 12. People would do the same thing in real-time with pause versus turn-based. Nuh-uh. For example, in real-time with pause systems, all actions occur synchronously, while in turn-based systems they occur asynchronously. This radically influences the orders you give characters, the way you prioritize threats, etc., especially if a game has some sort of initiative system in place where combatants get different numbers of moves based on initiative. This was in response to my 6th point where I said this: between the two systems, the actual tactics or options you have are pretty much the same. At least I think it's in response to that. Firstly, the things you do in any software is indicative of the functionality it provides, regardless of the rendering of the effects of your decisions in the environment, in real time, turn-based, static, dynamic, sound, text on screen, whatever. So that's not really an argument for one or the other. I was trying to say that in both systems you both enact tactics, but not necessarily strategies, because some turn-based games don't have them. Strategies by design. So everyone in a game enacts tactics like fighting, spell casting, running away, kiting an enemy, peeling a comrade. Those would be mostly strategies, because those involve position. They also involve healing your comrades, and all the actual actions you take in a game are tactics. They're pretty much the same. Doesn't look right in turn-based, but that's just how that system was made. Again, that strategy can't exist in menu-based, turn-based games. There are the variations, for example, in real-time games like RTSs and MOBAs. You can stun an enemy, while in a game like Final Fantasy Tactics, you have the don't act or the don't move abilities, which is roughly the same thing. That's what I'm trying to say here. Secondly, I wouldn't use the word synchronous. I would suggest simultaneous, such as in real-time with pause systems, all actions occur simultaneously, because that would imply that you're doing the same action together if it was synchronous. Also, I don't like this part of the sentence that says turn-based systems occur asynchronously, implies that they do not operate out of phase, when we know that some turn-based systems are phase-based, which would be kind of contradictory. Anyway, that's just me and my grammar. Now, the rest of this point 12 talks about initiative, which is now just rambling about the speed stat in a TRPG, which has nothing to do with the tactics themselves, but by virtue of it using such a turn-based system. In fact, those limit your tactics, because you can't pick and choose who to move next, and unless you can see the queue, you're not sure which of your units you can move next, so you may just be moving your character up to the front on a suicide location, which happens quite a lot in TRPGs like XCOM, regardless of how much you creep up to your target. So if you're only going a certain distance as opposed to the full distance. However, that's a common strategy depending on the situation, which is sometimes called juking, which occurs in RTSs and MOBAs and real-time with pause games, where you generate aggro and get the enemy team out of hiding, or burn all their ultimate attacks on you, or get them to chase after that one unit, kind of like a decoy. This could exist in some TRPGs, but it's usually not a very safe strategy and doesn't occur as dynamically as we'd like to see. 13. We want a systemically identical spiritual successor to Planescape Smudboy? The poll seems to indicate otherwise. I don't ever recall stating I wanted a systemically identical spiritual successor. I expect a few upgrades. Improving on something does not mean replacing it with a new system. The poll is also extremely close. Basic statistics tells us that any values less than 5% are not statistically significant, and the difference is less than 2%. So no, there is a very vocal and voting half who are not you, or we, apparently. 14, the fun thing is his posts aren't getting deleted. They're getting flagged by other users and added to the moderation queue, so his entire butthurt rage motivation for making his video is invalid. While you're right, my posts were not getting deleted. They were in fact getting into the moderation queue. A moderator actually messaged me and told me that after I made my video. To my knowledge, they have all been restored. So thank you for critiquing me.